Good evening. I see some familiar faces, which means that you are gluttons for punishment. Catholic social teaching, at least the modern version of it, begins with the era of Pope Leo XIII in the 19th century. His encyclical, Rerum Novarum, which was dealing with the problem of workers and the Industrial Revolution. But the truth of the matter is that Catholic social teaching, how the church interfaces with society, really goes all the way back to the time of St. Augustine in the 5th century. His famous work, De Civitate Dei, on the city of God. And Augustine talks about there's the city of God, there's the city of man, and that these two will always be opposed to each other. So we should not be surprised when we find people in the secular media elite speaking against the church. Our Lord already predicted this during his public ministry. He said, if they hated me, they will hate you. As a matter of fact, when I find a positive article in the New York Times about the Catholic Church, I get nervous because it generally means that the church is wrong. The New York Times is not going to say, I have a motto about the New York Times. For the New York Times, the only good Catholic is a bad Catholic. Right? So, what do we want to look at? But we want to look at the social teaching as that comes from the lips, the heart, and the pen of John Paul. And I would suggest that there are 3 or 4 cardinal principles of Catholic social teaching. The first is the dignity of the human person. And where does that come from? It comes right from the book of Genesis, that man is made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore, for that reason, has a unique dignity. Or as the Gaudium et Spes of the Second Vatican Council makes the point, that man, and probably John Paul wrote major sections of that document, that man is the only creature that God made for his own sake. And that because of the dignity of the human person, what we do has dignity. So there's a dignity to our work. John Paul reflected on that in his encyclical Laborem Exercens, on the dignity of work, that man is a co-creator with God. Many of you know people who are turning around 59, 60, and they say, can't wait to retire, can't wait to retire. And then the second day of retirement, the wife is saying, would you please get out of the house? Because you're driving me crazy. Because we don't know, we're hardwired to work. Sometimes we got the wrong idea. In religion classes in the 50s, sometimes you would be told that one of the punishments for the sin of Adam was that man had to work. That's not true. Adam and Eve worked in the garden. What's the punishment? The punishment is that we would see this work as useless and futile and hard by the sweat of the brow, the book of Genesis says. So work is connatural to a human being. So because we have a dignity by virtue of our creation in the image and likeness of God, what we do, likewise, has dignity. Secondly, is the principle of the common good. And this is a very important concept, and it's something that's very difficult for Americans who are very individualistic to swallow. And Americans have always had that rugged individualism. It comes with the whole pioneer mentality. But it's gotten worse in recent times. And so we actually now live in an era of radical individualism and alienation. I said to the seminarians this morning, we see that this era of social media was supposed to connect people all over the place. And as a matter of fact, people have never been more alienated than they are right now. Everyone lives in his own little isolation tube. So the common good, or as John Paul would often refer to it as solidarity. And what does solidarity mean? Most of you are old enough to remember the Three Musketeers. What was the motto? One for all for one. That's what solidarity is. No one suffers alone, and everyone works for the good of everyone else. So the common good and solidarity play off each other. And then finally, the principle of subsidiarity. And what does that mean? That we ought to do things at the lowest level possible. So you find out that someone has some kind of a physical problem, you don't write to the president in Washington. You handle it locally. And if the local source cannot deal with it, you move up the ladder farther and farther. But you don't jump from the bottom all the way to the top. When I was a high school administrator, invariably an irate parent would come to me and say, "I don't like what Mr. So-and-so said to my son." And I'd say, "Did you speak to Mr. So-and-so?" "No." "Did you speak to the chairman of the department?" "No." "Do you speak to the dean?" "No." "Did you speak to the vice principal?" "No." "Well, come all those steps and then come back to Father Peter," all right? Oh, but that's the principle of subsidiarity in an academic setting. Politically, it means you do as much at the local level, the municipal level, as possible. What cannot be done there at the state level, and only in the final analysis do you go federal with something. And we see very often people have that concept all botched up in their minds, and therefore we have all kinds of government controls, federal government controls, that the Founding Fathers never envisioned. So what I'm going to do is treat you to large portions of John Paul and his thoughts on these various issues. So in his 1987 encyclical, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, on social concern, he says, "Solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all." So pay attention very closely to this, huh? It's the good of all and of each individual. So it's not a zero-sum game that if I give something to you, there's less of something for me. No, as a matter of fact, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that good is diffusive of itself. In other words, doing good impels other people to do good. So it's not that I have 5 pounds of good, and if I give you 1 pound, I'm only left with 4. No, on the contrary, right? It's precisely the opposite. The more good that is done, the more good that is available. Sometimes you'll hear people when they talk about fundraising projects for churches, and a bishop will say, for example, "Oh, I don't know if I want that fundraising thing to go down at the parish. It might be less for the diocese," all right? I'm sure a bishop doesn't say that, but in point of fact, that's exactly false. All the statistics tell us that if someone is willing to give here, in all likelihood, he's willing to give in another place as well, precisely on this principle of good being diffusive of itself. John Paul's inaugural homily was a masterpiece, huh? And I want to quote a couple of paragraphs out of that, because they were programmatic for his pontificate. Toward the end, he says this: "Brothers and sisters, do not be afraid to welcome Christ and accept his power. Help the Pope and all those who wish to serve Christ, and with Christ's power to serve the human person and the whole of mankind. Do not be afraid. Open wide the doors for Christ. To his saving power, open the boundaries of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. So often today, man does not know what is within him, in the depths of his mind and heart. So often he is uncertain about the meaning of his life on this earth. He is assailed by doubt, a doubt which turns into despair. We ask you, therefore, we beg you, with humility and trust, let Christ speak to man. He alone has words of life, yes, of eternal life. Notice what the Pope has done here. He's made an appeal to political authorities, And you can imagine the people in the Kremlin are hearing this, Open wide the boundaries of states, economic and political systems. But in what is he grounding that? Precisely in the relationship between the individual believer and Jesus Christ. And he says, we have no reason to be afraid of Christ. 27 years later, Benedict XVI would quote portions of this in his own inaugural homily, and he would say, people sometimes are afraid that if they give their lives to Christ, they're going to lose out on things. All my years in high school work, that was one of the things kids always said. Oh, you can't do this, and you can't do that, and you can't do the other thing. And Benedict says, one who gives his life to Christ loses nothing that is good or true or beautiful, and gains everything else besides. And this is the point that John Paul is making on the first day of his inauguration as sovereign pontiff. But notice again how he merges the church's political vision, and we have a political vision because the church exists in the world. She exists already in eternity, the saints triumphant, but the church, meanwhile, here on earth, has to deal with the reality of social and political systems. We're not Jehovah's Witnesses, who say we don't have anything to do with the state, except when we want something. No, the church is intimately involved, and part of our role is precisely to try to fulfill Augustine's dream that more and more the city of man would reflect the city of God. And so, by virtue of our baptism and confirmation, we should be the agents of God's kingdom in secular society. And we have failed pretty miserably at that, and we'll come back to that point toward the end. The second is just a few months after, less than a year after his inaugural homily, John Paul made his first pastoral visit to the United States. And in his Mass on the Mall in Washington, D.C., he gave a rousing homily. It happened to coincide, two interesting coincidences. Of course, in the Christian scheme of things, we don't see these as coincidences. They're the work of providence. It was Right to Life Sunday, and the gospel for the day happened to be on divorce and remarriage. Right? And so I'm going to give you some extensive quotes, but they're well worth remembering. I shall all the more gladly lead you in reflecting on the Word of God as proposed by the Church today, because all over the world the bishops are discussing marriage and family life, because part of the synod on the family was going on, lived in dioceses and nations. The bishops are doing this in preparation for the next World Synod of Bishops, which has as its theme the role of the Christian family in the contemporary world. Your own bishops, meaning of the United States, have designated next year as a year of study, planning, and pastoral renewal with regard to the family. For a variety of reasons, there is a renewed interest throughout the world in marriage, in family life, and in the value of all human life. This very Sunday marks the beginning of the annual Respect Life program, through which the Church in the United States intends to reiterate its conviction regarding the inviolability of human life in all stages. Let us then all together renew our esteem for the value of human life, remembering also that through Christ, all human life has been redeemed. And notice how he's always back and forth between the city of man and the city of God. We have this particular position about the sacredness of human life. Why? Precisely because we're created by God, redeemed by Christ, and sanctified by the Holy Spirit. So it's not simply do-goodism, all right? It's not social theory for its own sake. It's precisely that this is how we redeem the world, in union with Christ. He goes on, I do not hesitate to proclaim before you and before the world that all human life, from the moment of conception and through all subsequent stages, is sacred, because human life is created in the image and likeness of God. Nothing surpasses the greatness or dignity of a human person. Human life is not just an idea or an abstraction. Human life is the concrete reality of a being that lives, that acts, that grows and develops. Human life is the concrete reality of a being that is capable of love and of service to humanity. So, this notion that human life is sacred, when I was a high school administrator, I would say to my religion teachers, I don't want you to spend an inordinate amount of time in religion classes on the issue of abortion. No. I want that treated in a biology class. After the unit on fetology, after the unit on genetics, the teacher then says, and this is the point here, it's not some weird esoteric doctrine of the Catholic Church that the child in the womb is human. That's a teaching of science. We've been told for the past 6 months ad nauseum, follow the science, all right? Well, we follow the science, and science tells us that that being is a human being, all right? No one else has that kind of a genetic construction. And for that, because it's human, then again, we don't need God to tell us this. Philosophy tells us that that being has certain rights and therefore needs to be protected in law. And again, we'll return to that point. Let me repeat what I told the people during my recent pilgrimage to my homeland. If a person's right to life is violated at the moment in which he is first conceived in his mother's womb, an indirect blow is struck also at the whole of the moral order, which serves to ensure the inviolable goods of man. Among those goods, life occupies the first place. The Church defends the right to life not only in regard to the majesty of the Creator, who is the first giver of this life, but also in respect of the essential good of the human person. Once again, made in the image and likeness of God. Human life is precious because it is the gift of a God whose love is infinite. And when God gives life, it is forever. Life is also precious because it is the expression and the fruit of love. This is why life should spring up within the setting of marriage, and why marriage and the parents' love for one another should be marked by generosity in self-giving. The great danger for family life in the midst of any society whose idols are pleasure, comfort, and independence lies in the fact that people close their hearts and become selfish. The fear of making permanent commitments can change the mutual love of husband and wife into two loves of self, two loves existing side by side until they end in separation. Notice how he's tied in this just 4 paragraphs. Respect for life, the sanctity of marriage, and the family. All of these things are of one piece. And what do we see under fire in a very, very vicious way, particularly in the past 10 years? All of those elements being attacked. In that same social encyclical of his, in 1987, he explains what Catholic social teaching is and is not. He says the Church's social doctrine is not an ideology, all right? Rather, the accurate formulation of the results of a careful reflection on the complex realities of human existence in society and in the international order, in the light of faith and of the Church's tradition. Its main aim is to interpret these realities, determining their conformity with or divergence from the lines of the gospel teaching on man and his vocation, a vocation which is at once earthly and transcendent. Its aim is thus to guide Christian behavior. It therefore belongs to the field not of ideology, but of theology, and particularly of moral theology. So sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, that's some, strange thing of Catholic ideology. You people have hang-ups on this issue and that issue. No, his whole point is, this is not ideology. Actually, those who fight against us are the ideologues. Ours is very, very pure, simple, and direct. In his visit in 1995 in Baltimore at Camden Yards, he said this: "Today, the challenge facing America is to find freedom's fulfillment in truth. The truth that is intrinsic to human life, here we go, created in God's image and likeness, the truth that is written on the human heart, the truth that can be known by reason and can therefore form the basis of a profound and universal dialogue among people about the direction they must give to their lives and their activities. Notice, once again, he grounds everything in truth, the pursuit of truth. St. Augustine will say what? Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Well, who is the thee? He, the one who is absolute truth. And he says that we can pursue these things, these truths, by virtue of reason alone. And this is one of the most important contributions that Catholic social teaching makes to our nation. Although we would find ourselves in common agreement, for example, with evangelicals, fundamentalists, Orthodox Jews on issues of life and family and marriage, our approach to those issues when we deal in the public forum, we don't say the fifth commandment says thou shalt not kill when we talk to Congress. We say science tells us that, therefore. And so using simply reason, we can come to a conclusion with an atheist, an agnostic, a Muslim, a Jew on these issues. Now, we go a step farther to say, yes, as a matter of fact, there is a commandment that says thou shalt not kill. But we don't have to enter the theological realm in order to make our point in the civil realm. And then in his, in his apostolic exhortation on the laity, Christi Fidelis Laici, from 1988, he talks about the vocation and mission of the lay faithful. The inviolability of the person, which is a reflection of the absolute inviolability of God, finds its primary fundamental expression in the inviolability of human life. Above all, the common outcry, which is justly made on behalf of human rights, for example, the right to health, to home, to work, to family, to culture, is false and illusory if the right to life, the most basic and fundamental right and condition of all other personal rights, is not defended with maximum determination. The human being is entitled to such rights in every phase of development, from conception until natural death, whether healthy or sick, whole or handicapped, rich or poor. Indeed, everyone has the mission and responsibility of acknowledging the personal dignity of every human being and of defending the right to life. Some lay faithful are given particular title to this task, such as parents, teachers, healthcare workers, and the many who hold economic and political power. But notice what he takes head on. Sometimes you'll hear people saying, well, you know, this particular politician, all right, he's pro-abortion, but boy, is he good on health care and is he good on education? Folks, if you ain't alive, you can't have health care or education, all right? The basic issue is life, all right? If you can't get born, none of these other things make any sense. And again, we're going to return to that. At the conclusion of the, every 5 years in theory, bishops go to Rome to make what's called an ad limina visit, ad limina apostolorum, to the thresholds of the apostles. And they meet with members of the Roman Curia, and sometime during that visit with the Pope himself, ostensibly to make a report on the status animarum, on the state of the souls committed to their care. And in 11 or 12 regions in the United States? Bishop, you remember?
15.
Is it 15?
15th is the Eastern Rite, but it's 14 physically.
Oh, okay. And they go by regions in this country to Rome, usually. And in 1998, at the last hurrah of the American bishops, John Paul spoke these words to those bishops. Today, I believe the Lord is saying to us all, do not hesitate, do not be afraid to engage the good fight of the faith. When we preach the liberating message of Jesus Christ, we are offering the words of life to the world. Our prophetic witness is an urgent, essential service, not just to the Catholic community, but to the whole human family. So, again, the church inserted into the family of man has something to say. Paul VI famously remarked that the church is an expert in humanity. We've been at this game for 2,000 years. We ought to know something about human nature, which never changes, for better or for worse, huh? But notice how John Paul phrases this, that the message of Christ is liberating. And all too often, people outside the church see the message of the church as negative. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. Well, there are shalt nots, but the purpose of the shalt not is in order to do something that's positive, okay? When a man gets married, he excludes every woman in the world except for one, right? Sometimes with my high school students, they say, oh, geez, you you guys can't get married. And I say, I'm only different from your father by one woman. Some of you are a little slow, that's all right. It'll come, don't worry. But what we do is an essential service because it's in service of the human person. Pope Benedict, when he came to the States in 2008 and gave his talk to Catholic educators in Washington, he spoke about Catholic schools fulfilling a purpose not simply for the good of the church, but he says that the Catholic schools ennoble the soul of the nation. We do something that's for ourselves, for our own children, and for the good of the church, absolutely. But those kids are going to be part of civil society. And what do we function? We hope they're going to function as the leaven, the salt, the light of society. And that's the church's social mission, not simply in terms of how we regulate our personal lives, but how we attempt to influence public policy. And the church has both a right and an obligation to do that. All right? Sometimes you hear, oh, that's the church meddling in the affairs of government. No. As a Catholic, as Catholics, all of us, whether layperson or priest or religious, I don't lose my civil rights the day of my baptism or my ordination. All right? I continue to function as a member of civil society, and if I'm going to be faithful to my obligation to be a patriot, that means that I have to share what is nearest and dearest to me. And therefore, that contributes in a pluralistic society. All the voices need to be heard. And what we find, of course, in recent years is the silencing of people that we don't want to hear from, all right? And so, shut up. You heard that in one of the presidential debates, right? Shut up. Right? Imagine, first of all, how crude, okay? But over and above that, the silencing of the voice of conscience, the silencing of the voice of life. And then John Paul deals with something that's also very, very interesting. He talks about the mysterium iniquitatis and the mysterium pietatis, the mystery of iniquity, of sin, and the mystery of the good. And he talks about this in particular in his apostolic exhortation on the sacrament of penance, Reconciliatio et Penitentia, from 1984. So you're trying to understand, if any of you have been involved, for example, in protesting in front of an abortion clinic, huh? You're standing there with a sign, or maybe with a rosary, and what comes by? This hate spewed at you. I mean, vulgarity of every kind, people seething. What brings that about? That's the mystery of iniquity, huh? You're not doing anything bad, huh? You're there as a citizen, you're there as a concerned human being, and you get this reaction. And John Paul explains what the problem is. In order to understand sin, we have had to direct our attention to its nature as made known to us by the revelation of the economy of salvation. This is the mysterium iniquitatis. But in this economy, sin is not the main principle, still less the victor. Sin fights against another active principle, which, to use a beautiful evocative expression of St. Paul, we can call the mysterium or sacramentum pietatis. Man's sin would be the winner and in the end destructive. God's salvific plan would remain incomplete or even totally defeated if this Mysterium Pietatis were not made part of the dynamism of history in order to conquer man's sin. So this ongoing battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, that's been with us since the sin of our first parents and will be with us to the end of time. However, we ought not to be depressed about that problem because, as a matter of fact, through the power of Christ's resurrection, we know that the ultimate battle has been fought and the war has been fought and won. What remain are the battles, the strategic battles that you and I have a role to play. But you can fight the battles because you have the confidence, the faith, to believe that the war has already been fought and won. And that's our part as Christians, all right? We used to refer to us here below in the church as the church militant, aside from how that's been used elsewhere today. But at any rate, it is a battle. St. Paul talks about that constantly. The Christian life is a battle. And that's part of our responsibility. Those of us who were confirmed in the old rite, you remember that after you're being signed with the sacred oil, the bishop gave you a little slap on the cheek, and it was to remind you that you are now to be a soldier in Christ's army. We've lost sight of that, and that we're doing things that are not necessarily popular, but are good and important. And those of us who are priests, teachers, parents, we all know that at times we have to do and say things that are not necessarily even what we want to do, but we know we have to do. And we do them out of love for the other, hoping that the other one is going to perceive the importance of what we're doing. And sometimes they say, 20 years later, I got an email from a young woman 2 Christmases ago. She said, you probably don't remember me, but I hated that freshman English class that you taught us, and you made us write 3 essays a week, but I wanted to let you know that I just finished my doctoral dissertation, and that never would have happened if you hadn't done in freshman year what you did. Okay? And very often, parents will hear the same thing. So I say we have to have the mentality of the long-distance runner. If you're looking for immediate self-gratification or immediate affirmation, you're in the wrong game as a Christian in general, let alone as a parent or anyone else, and certainly in dealing with civil society. Another mention of John Paul to another group of bishops, it is a tribute to the church and to the openness of American society that so many Catholics in the United States are involved in political life. Democracy is a moral adventure, a continuing test of a people's capacity to govern themselves in ways that serve the common good and the good of individual citizens. The survival of a particular democracy depends not only on its institutions, but to an even greater extent on the spirit which inspires and permeates its procedures for legislating, administering, and judging. The future of democracy, in fact, depends on a culture capable of forming men and women who are prepared to defend certain truths and values. And if you read documents of some of our founding fathers, like Madison and Jefferson, Madison says that this government of ours will never survive the minute it is uprooted from its biblical principles. Well, isn't that exactly what we've been witnessing for almost 35, 40 years right now, is the attempt precisely to uproot the United States from its Judeo-Christian principles. In Evangelium Vitae, the Holy Father's encyclical on the gospel of life, he spells out in more detail what I alluded to earlier. It is impossible to further the common good without acknowledging and defending the right to life, upon which all the other inalienable rights of individuals are founded and from which they develop. While all life issues are important and deserve our attention, one is paramount: the right to life of the unborn. Very simple. And I would recommend to you, we're going to talk a little more detail momentarily about the election, but every 4 years the American hierarchy produce a document on faithful citizenship. Now, as is typical of ecclesiastical documents, they're 150 pages, 200 pages long, but there are Reader's Digest versions of it. But one of the points that's made, actually probably 3 times in the document, is precisely the preeminence of the right to life. And once again on the principle, if you're not born, no other rights make sense. And where does that find itself even in American jurisprudence? Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can't have liberty or pursuit of happiness without the right to life. And we end up back where we started. Do not be afraid to welcome Christ and accept his power. Help the Pope and all those who wish to serve Christ, and with Christ's power to serve the human person and the whole of mankind. Do not be afraid. Open wide the doors for Christ. To his saving power, open the boundaries of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. Now, where does that position us as Catholics? 10 days out from arguably the most important election in our lifetime? I gave the seminarians a little lesson in American civics this morning. And many of you are old enough to remember this from personal experience. My 4 grandparents came here in that second wave of immigration at the beginning of the 20th century, 1908, 1910, 1912. And when they arrived, they found themselves in hostile territory. There was a very visceral anti-Catholicism, and they were doubly disenfranchised. They couldn't speak English, and they were coming into a foreign country that was anti-Catholic. My mother would recount stories that when she was a little girl in Brooklyn, there would be signs on apartment buildings that said vacancy, Catholics and dogs need not apply. All right? It was something that was very, very real. And when these Catholic immigrants arrived, very often the welcome mat was put out for them by the Democratic Party. Help them find a job, help them find a home, help them do this and help them do that. So that in the Catholic consciousness, and we are an immigrant church in this country, I'm the grandson of 4 immigrants. It's also a testimony to the wonderful Catholic school system that the grandson of 4 immigrants is a priest with 2 doctorates. All right, it's what can happen in a matter of 2 generations. At any rate, to be Catholic in some way was merged in our minds with being Democrats. And I remember the first presidential election in which I was able to vote, was 1972, Nixon. And my mother said, well, how are you going to vote? And I said, well, I'm going to vote for Nixon. And she said, how can you? We're Catholic and he's a Republican. Notice that equation was very, very strong. And so I explained to my mother how McGovern was absolutely hopeless and that his program would take us down a very, very bad path. And she said, I don't understand. I can never understand that. And so I went to vote, and as I raised my arm to pull the lever for Nixon, I felt spasms. I said, oh my gosh, I'm doing something that nobody in my family has ever done in the 50 years, all right? I pulled it down. And I called my mother that night and I said, did you or Daddy vote? And she said, yeah. She said, did you? I said, yeah. She said, for whom did you vote? I said, I told you I was going to vote for Nixon, and I did. And I said, and what about you and Dad? She said, we voted for Nixon too. Now, I mention this for the simple reason, we've got to get rid of this tribal mentality that has plagued Catholicism for 70 years in this country. Because of this absurd connection, this tribal allegiance to party over policy, we have found ourselves with the Kennedys, the Cuomos, the Pelosi's, the Bidens, the whole crowd of them, who claim some kind of Catholic allegiance simply because, water was poured on their head and water was poured on our head, and therefore we have, they're one of us. We don't vote by personality, all right? And if we do, we are failing in our civic responsibility. We vote on the basis of policy. And you line up the policies and you look at what they are and you say, this is eminently clear, all right? And one of the things that is very, very clear in moral theology is one may never vote for the advancement of the cause of abortion or to vote for one who chooses to move the country in that direction or to keep it there. And that's an unpleasant thought to some people, huh? But nonetheless, that's exactly what the bishops mean when they say it's a preeminent issue. There is such a thing. We're not single-issue voters, okay? Single-issue voters, that doesn't necessarily make sense. But there are what we call disqualifying positions. So, for example, if we find out that John Smith is a member of the KKK or he's a neo-Nazi, we say that kind of a person doesn't have the character fit to be a public official in a democratic, pluralistic society. That's a disqualifying vote. Or Tom Jones is a neo-Nazi, okay? That kind of a position is incompatible with service in a country like ours. Similarly, we have to say, anyone who is interested in advancing the cause of abortion has a policy that is uncivilized. I mentioned to the people last night, and it bears repeating today, back about 10 years ago, when this question first came up about Catholic politicians who are pro-abortion should not be given Holy Communion, and Canon 915. And Cardinal Orinse, the Nigerian delightful fellow who was in charge of divine worship for the church for about 10 years, was on one of his summer tours of America. He loves America. And he happened to be here when that firestorm first broke. And a reporter came to him and said, Your Eminence, what do you think about this business of Catholic politicians who are pro-abortion not receiving communion? And in his very, very clever Nigerian way, he said, Why are you asking me? Well, because you're the head of divine worship for the Catholic Church. No, he said. You've got the wrong person. Oh, whom should I get? And he said, Do you have a Catholic school in your parish? He said, Yes. He said, Go to the second grade, the children who are preparing to receive Holy Communion, and ask them, do you think someone who wants to kill a baby should be receiving Holy Communion? They'll give you the answer. Don't talk to me about it. Right? It's very simple, okay? And as I said to the people last night, sometimes people say, well, it's a complicated issue. It really isn't. It really isn't, okay? And when we start talking about things being complicated, we're complicating it. St. Thomas Aquinas tells us God is simple, all right? God is simple. And the things of God are really simple. And most of the time, they're really even open to just basic good common sense. But as Chesterton tells us, what's the only problem with common sense? It ain't too common, okay? So, any questions, comments? Nothing? Well, Cardinal O'Malley, when he was the Bishop of Fall River, Massachusetts, wrote a pastoral letter in 1992 on the impending election. And he explained what I just said about the right to life being the preeminent issue. And he said that politicians who are trying to pretend to be Catholic and who hold contrary to positions, he said, they are members of the KKK without the white sheets, all right? And he said, so one can never vote for such a person, he said. And he said, and if any Catholic has done that, he better make a hasty move from the curtain of the voting booth to the curtain of the confessional, all right? And so I hope that no one here on November 4th has to make a trip to the confessional. And you're held responsible because now you've been told precisely what the church teaches, and therefore the greater responsibility is yours at that point. All right, well, thank you for your kind attention.